Well, Hoppers, these are crazy times. This has to be the most urgent situation I guess you guys at the RPA have ever dealt with.
Yeah, we've been sort of at this, I guess, for just under a month now when the clubs announced that they were taking the pay cuts. And, we are where we are now. We've made some progress over that time. It's been very challenging. A lot of players, quite rightly, sort of terrified as to what the future may hold, and trying to give them as much advice, both on the contract that they have, but also the sort of ongoing situation. And there are just there's so much uncertainty even now, a month in, around return to play when the season may or may not start again. So just a lot of very anxious people, as there are globally, and we fully understand the context of everything that's happened. And now I think it's about how we can try and move that forward.
If we look at the financial side of things and the players' salaries and the agreement amongst the players, amongst the various clubs, the 13 clubs, to cut payments, it was done unilaterally amongst the clubs. Would you have preferred it to have come from a slightly more structured position, maybe from yourselves?
We knew that the clubs wanted to make a quick decision, but we think historically we've always worked better as a sport when the Players Association and the league have those discussions. I think there was an owners meeting on the 18th of March. On the 19th of March, we had a players board meeting at which it was introduced. And I think then in the next 24, 48 hours, it all came to pass. So that we understood the panic that had set in at the time when there was so much uncertainty. But I think if you look at other sports, not only in England with the PFA and the PCA, but also in North American sports, I think a collective approach tends to be the best way forward. Understanding also you've got 13 different entities within the Premiership, all of whom have different P&L and financial models. But I think what we have done now is we're now moving it forward across a number of issues within the sport, working closer with Premiership Rugby so we can actually answer those centrally and just create more, I guess, better awareness and certainty. I think, we could dwell on how this has all been done, but I think we've just got to move forward now because we're in this situation. And I think as we've even seen with Saracen's comments yesterday, everyone is in this together. In many ways, it was Hobson's choice because, we were told this is happening. And now I think it's how do we make the best of this situation going forward?
Is it important to look at this now as a global problem rather than just a Gallagher Premiership problem? Because the whole game seems to be in financial meltdown.
Yeah, I mean, I guess we tend to look at things locally, nationally, and internationally from our perspective. The local situation is that France and England have philanthropic owners who invest huge amounts of money into making the sport viable. From a national perspective, you now look at what's happening in Australia and in America, filing for Chapter 11 over there. So, and certainly talking to our counterparts in Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, France, you recognise that the free fall that the world is in economically is absolutely impacting on rugby. And there are some significant concerns, again, looking at New Zealand and 50% potential deferments or wage cuts, Australia, possibly even bigger. So in an ironic sort of way, you sort of think, well, is this an opportunity to try and press a bit of a reset button on where rugby's at? And you and I know from back in the day when it first started, it was this sort of Wild West environment. It's moved and matured over that time. But now we're sort of into this situation whereby the current models are not sustainable. And again, I sort of look at the owners and what they've done for English rugby, but also the international game, and do World Rugby and the unions and the clubs and the players as a collective need to sit down and say, okay, well, what do we all need to work through to find a better solution? It would be a total waste of an opportunity caused by this horrendous pandemic to actually not sit down, park a bit of self-interest, which again, you and I well know has been prevalent throughout the last 20 odd years of rugby.
We're asking a lot here, aren't we?
But also getting people to be a bit joined up. And that's where the player voice is so important in all of this, is because we can't just keep saying, let's play more games, I've come off a call this morning. We're talking about the possible return to play of the Gallagher Premiership, and if that involves midweek rugby, which happens in World Cups and on Lions tours, what will that look like for squad selection? So there are so many moving parts in the current scenario. We just need to make sure that the sort of principles we all buy into around welfare, around, again, which play into sort of a commercial element and the survival of clubs locally, is paramount. So for me, it's someone described this as like three-dimensional chess, because you're trying to move in so many different directions with so many different stakeholders. But I think it's about trying to protect what we have, but also, are there ways that we can do things better than we currently do? The old caught in the pint pot and 41 weekends of rugby and, extension of the season and this sort of thing. Is this the opportunity that we all needed to sort of wake up and take it forward?
But let's say we get the green light and the government says, yes, you can play, potentially behind closed doors, but it's not going to be a stress on the NHS, so yes, games go ahead. How might that structure look? How might that tail end of the season look? Are we going to play every single scheduled game?
Well, that's actually the ambition at the moment amongst the clubs, because obviously they have no discernible income coming in currently, and whether that's behind closed doors, going back on TV, and obviously Darren Charles, the Premiership Rugby Chief Executive, said that's a stated ambition of the league. It's just quite hard. There's so much conjecture around it at the moment. I think from the players' perspective, what we're keen to understand is they've taken pay cuts, not deferrals. Obviously, in Saracen's case, that's a different scenario. They go back down to the Championship next year, but they've taken pay cuts. And questions are: so when does full pay return? When does furloughing stop? When does return to training happen? So all of these things, and largely driven, as you say, by government, medical, health and safety, strength and conditioning, all these sorts of issues have to be factored into when it's feasible for the league to start up again.
This weekend would have been the restart weekend. Clearly a huge, huge factor of what the RPA is all about. And you've mentioned already about player welfare. Have you had phone calls from players who are struggling now in this situation?
So we have a 24/7 confidential counselling service that we've set up many years ago to look after the players. And I think in the current period of sort of anxiety, we talk a lot about mental health within sport, and 1 in 4 people in society suffer from mental health. And we're seeing the pressures ramping up year on year in terms of athletes and where they're at, and the players. So there's certainly a greater demand placed on Restart, which solely funds all the mental health support within the game. And again, it's something we're talking to the clubs and the RFU about, is how can we provide better resource for that fantastic charity to help the players, because not only are we doing mental health, we've also got the likes of Michael Fatialofa, who's making fantastic recovery up in the Royal Bucks, supported by Worcester, who've been great, and the players there. But from a charitable perspective, we just need to make sure that we've got enough resource to provide that ongoing support for players and their families in what is such an extraordinary time. Because as you know, as we all know, players love certainty. They love the belonging, the week by week structure of their club environment. And certainly for those players who are coming off contract at the end of this season, if the season goes into July and August, again, the questions are, do those contracts get extended? Do they fall away? And some of those players who are coming to the end of distinguished careers were thinking they'd go out on the high and playing for their clubs and cheered off the field, and that may not happen. So those sorts of issues, I think, really start to play into the sort of mental health issues that we see day in, day out with players.
Are we expecting more teams, more players to be furloughed through other clubs? And if that happens, what sort of advice are you prepared, or are you preparing to give to those players?
Well, we've had our lawyer on sort of 24/7, sort of red air on the phone pretty much for the last month, and just trying to make sure that players have got sufficient advice, and the majority of players are being furloughed across the Premiership. I think sometimes people think of professional sports as, well, they're all on the same sort of levels as Premier League footballers, and that's not the case. So in terms of the furloughing, it's players making sure that those rights are reserved and that the clubs, there's a good dialogue between club and player, how the furloughing process will happen. So it's getting as much information to the players as possible. I think what's really critical in all of this is at the end of this, hopefully sooner rather than later, everyone's got to come out the other end and play for each other. And those club player relations are absolutely paramount to how this moves forward. And I think we're pretty lucky within rugby that, by and large, the players are, they're sharp. And when it comes to their own sort of income and salaries, as you imagine, it's a very emotive issue, but one that they're well informed on. So it's just making sure that we are discharging our duty as the players' union to make sure they have as much information as possible, so that when the time does come for everyone to return to full training, come out the other side and start playing again, that we're in a good and strong position.
You've got the academy players at the bottom, and then you've got the elite players at the top, and this band in the middle of players who weren't quite sure where they might end up. Are we going to start seeing a narrowing of those bands now, that the excesses won't be paid anymore?
At the moment, no one's recruiting. I mean, apart from obviously the likes of Johnny May and Carl Sinclair as sort of headline players who are moving to Gloucester and Bristol, respectively. But there aren't many clubs recruiting in the current environment, which is entirely understandable. But I think if you look at the scenario we've got, we call it the squeeze middle. So you've obviously got your marquee top-end players who are earning significant salaries. And the average salary in the Premiership is around about £140,000, £150,000 a year. And that goes all the way down to some academy players who'd be on minimum wage. So when we're talking about pay cuts, obviously one of the ambitions is to make sure that those players on minimum wage aren't going below minimum wage. So trying to get that information, make sure the clubs are doing that, which they are. But it's certainly that squeeze middle is a concern, because players have been going into contract renegotiations and clubs are offering them 20 or 30% less than they're currently on. And I just think this is part of the evening out of where the game is going to go. I think we're going to see a shift in the economics of the sport, but it's quite hard again in the current environment to say where that will go to. But for me, the value of a good club player is always, paramount to the success of the better clubs.
Hoppers, thank you so much for joining us. Good luck with all the work you're going to do. Let us hope at some point we settle on sunnier shores. Thanks for joining us, Hoppers.
Thanks for the time. Cheers.